Last Sabbath I was talking to Edwin, and he said he's going to be here definitely this week, and I said it'll be my last Sabbath, or basically my last sermon, and he said, we want to do an item for you. And I said, oh, that's great. Then I got a call through the week or a text from Lynn, we've got a special item arranged for you. And I went, oh, okay, we've already got one, so we'll have two. And I want to really thank you for your contribution this morning, both to John and to Giselle. Thank you very much. It was beautiful, wasn't it? Okay, now church finishes in 4 minutes. So should we just have the benediction now or... Watch it. I was thinking about what to share with you this morning, and I will shorten it up a little bit if I can. And some things came to mind, and I want to share a little bit, through the sermon a little bit further, about some recollections of Penrith Church itself. And this is one little verse that came to mind. This is one little saying that came to mind. It's an obvious but vital truth. Without God's leading, we go our own way. Without God's leading, we go our own way. And I was reminded of a quote from Life Sketches. As individuals and as a movement, we have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history. Do you believe that? And it's amazing as we look back over our lives how God has led in different ways. I'm thinking specifically this morning of a biblical illustration how God led the children of Israel out of the land. Just for Moses to be there was God's leading in itself. But when they left, he showed them the way through the wilderness. They weren't sure where they were going. I guess it would be like being lost somewhere and not knowing where you're going, but God was leading them. And we know the story so well, and I'm going to move through it pretty quickly this morning, how they left and they got to the Red Sea itself, and there they were. And they thought they would camp there for the night, and we know the verses themselves, but I want to read to you a quote here also. I think it was from Life Sketches as well, just about this incident. On the memorable event of their deliverance from Egypt, Israel, under the leadership of Moses, had retired into a defile between the mountains on the shore of the Red Sea. As Moses observed the spot to which God led him and his people, it did not appear to be the most advantageous camping site for a people fleeing from their oppressors. Trained in military strategy in the schools of Egypt, it seemed to Moses a possible trap. Here they are, hemmed in by unscalable mountains on both the north and the south side, and with the foam-capped waves of the Red Sea blocking the exit to the east. But, in compliance with God's word, Moses led the children of Israel into the place of God's own choosing. God had led them there. It wasn't a trap. As evening wore on and darkness fell over the camp of Israel, the weary people retired for needed rest after an eventful day. Soon they began to hear the rumblings from the west. Suddenly, they realised that these sounds were coming from the approaching of the Egyptian army. Scary situation. Terror filled the camp. They were sure they were trapped. They saw their true plight as a motley array of slaves without a hope of escape. Behind them, into the opening between the mountains, the vanguards of the Egyptian army were streaming. Amid the distraught and fearful multitude, Moses stood serene. He knew God had directed him in leading his people to this place. He did not know what was going to happen, but he knew they were there in compliance with God's command. And he was confident that God had a way of escape for them. Moses trusted in God for deliverance from their apparent impasse. Then came God's command, go forward. Through the turbulent waters of the Red Sea, a way of escape was opened up to a bewildered Israel. That night God delivered his people. When the sun rose the next morning, the Egyptian army was gone. The soldiers had been drowned in the Red Sea. But on the shore of the Sinai Peninsula, the children of Israel stood, singing the song of deliverance and praise to God for his miraculous salvation. What a marvellous thing that God had done for them. God had led them out. He had led them to that place. He had then led them through what seemed almost eternal death. He had led them through it. What else did God do for the children of Israel? We know about the manna. The children of Israel were complaining because they'd been led out and they were running out of food. Would have been better if we'd have stayed in Egypt, they were saying. At least we had food there. And then in Exodus 16 and verse 4, God said to Moses, "Look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you." God had it under control. And he told them that what they were to do, that they were to gather only enough for the day's use. If they gathered more, what would happen to it? It would spoil. But what happened on Friday? They took 2 portions. Did it spoil overnight? No. God was leading them. Then they ran out of water. What did God do? God provided water from the rock. They rebelled against Moses and Aaron. And once again they said, "Why did you make us leave Egypt and bring us here in this terrible place? This land has no grain, no figs, no grapes, no pomegranates, and no water to drink." And going down further, as the people watch, speak to the rock over there and it will pour out water out of itself. You'll provide enough water for the rocks, from the rocks, to satisfy the whole community and their livestock. God is leading them again. But how quickly did they forget their leading? How quickly? God had led them through the Red Sea. He'd provided water, he'd provided food for them. And then we find them when Moses went up onto Mount Sinai. What happened? He'd gone away for too long, they thought. When the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. "Come on," they say, "make us some gods who can lead us." What had God been doing? Hadn't their God been leading them? Here they are wanting other gods. They want to make gods. Can we make God? It's crazy, isn't it? All these things that happen, yet they just out of the blue had forgotten all about it. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt. Aaron saw how excited the people were, so he built an altar in front of the calf. Then he announced, "Tomorrow we'll have a festival," and so on. God told Moses to get back down the mountain quickly, that things were going wrong. How quickly they have turned away from the way I commanded them to live. They have melted down gold and made a calf. They have bowed down and sacrificed to it. They are saying, "These are our gods." How could they do this, Maybe we would do things differently if we were there, would we? O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt? Who was it that brought them out? Yet they had forgotten God himself. They had forgotten how he had led them in the past. Sometimes God makes better choices for us than we can ever make for ourselves. Do you believe that? Yeah. And I think back over our life and how we ended up here at Penrith Church. Was God leading? Definitely was. There are so many things that happened prior to us coming here. I'm not going to go into them. We don't have time this morning. But just to let you know how we became members of Penrith Church. We'd been married. We were attending Blacktown Church. Adrian and Creena and Adrian, I better get it the right way around, had been born. And we were living in our mansion, and I say mansion, at Emu Heights. Now, some of you like to live in Emu Plains, but we were living in Emu Heights. And we had a mansion. I think Creena does remember something about the mansion. I don't think Adrian does. But this mansion, when we first were getting married, my father-in-law said, "Whatever you do, don't pay rent. Buy something. Doesn't matter what it is." Well, we bought a mansion. We paid less than $10,000 for it, but it was at Emu Heights. And I well remember a visiting minister one Sabbath afternoon coming to visit us, and a big thunderstorm came through. And we sat there with buckets out everywhere, talking backwards and forwards, and here were all the buckets and the water just dripping in. And Heather was quite embarrassed about that, our little mansion. But it was good that the pastor's wife said, "This reminds me of our first house." It was exactly the same. Our little mansion was quite a dump, really. But it was ours. But we were living there and driving all the way to Blacktown to church each week. Now, there's no M4, so it was through Penrith, all down the highway. We had a pastor down there by the name of Pastor George Metcalf, who later became pastor here. And he'd been transferred to Penrith Church, and we were still going to Blacktown Church. And he rang me up one day and he said, have you ever considered coming to Penrith Church, which is a lot closer? And we had sort of thought about that. And he said, oh, and by the way, nominating committee's been meeting. Now straight away, alarm bells go up, don't they, when the pastor rings and says, nominating committee's been meeting. And he said, we were wondering if you would transfer your membership to Penrith and become a deacon. And so we thought about it and we said yes. And so that's how we ended up coming here to Penrith Church. That's how God has led us, and lots of other things he has led us in as well, keeping us safe on the roads, and I'm sure you can tell stories, the same sorts of things. That's how we ended up here. But what about Penrith Church? Has God led Penrith Church? Now, I was planning to go down there and talk to Enid Brown through the microphone, but we'll skip that out this morning because of time. And if I don't get it right, Enid's going to tell me. But how did God lead in the building of Penrith Church? I understand, and I'm not going to ask how many years ago. It was a long time ago, Enid, wasn't it? Do you remember the year or not? No? No. And you were meeting, I understand, in the CWA rooms? Yep. In Penrith? Yep. And then there was a family of Adventists living right there, in that house right next door, the Gadsden family, and they donated this block of land. Not the one out there, just this block of land here, to build a church on. So here we've got a handful of people now looking at building a church. The church was built, the old church was built, and then somewhere along the line, and I've got no idea of dates, but this, what is the car park now, become available, and the church bought that. Now, it would have been around the 70s and 80s, and that was all grass. Yeah, there was an old house on it, but grass behind it, yeah. Children's Sabbath schools, yep. I'm getting to that, yep. Children's Sabbath schools in the little house, and there were some good times there, and the kitchen was used, and ordnance days. I think the men were over there and the women were over here, or vice versa. But it was grass out the back, and I remember when I was asked to be an elder in this church, I took on the name, or slack name if you like, as Rebel Elder. I drove a Ford Fairlane, very powerful. And I used to enjoy sitting out there just waiting for everyone else to get in the car after church. And if they were taking a bit too long to get in the car, I used to put my foot on the brake, one foot on the brake and one foot on the accelerator. The back brakes didn't lock up too well, but the front brakes did. And so you'd get the back wheels churning in the grass and raising, yes. And so anyway, but we had some good times out there. Who remembers, well, Lynn, you'll remember John and Eunice Vaughan. John was our head elder at the time. And Desiree's parents, yeah. And we used to have some good concerts out there. And I think that was even for raising money for our church, for the church itself. John had trucks and he'd park a truck out there, and that would be our stage area. And to remember some of the things they used to act on stage, black and white minstrel show. And Richard was part of it. Wherever you are, Richard, you remember that, painting your face up and suffering for ages after because you're allergic to the paint. I remember that. And they, you know, black and white minstrel show, they have like quartet and they sing, but they were miming. And they wanted somebody to mime the bass part. So guess who they got to do that? Heather. Little Heather miming this big bass part. But it was fun times. And this is what this church is built around. And I'm sure that was to raise money. I think we paid, I'm not sure, but I think it was to raise money as well. Lynn made mention a while ago of the Lamington drives. And that was fun. And it was in the hall, and it was a production line. And people wonder why this church is cracking and falling down a little bit. It's built on Lamingtons. It's built on Lamingtons. I can't remember how much we actually made on those, but we made a lot of money. Yeah, once a month or something we used to do it, and we'd do something like 100 dozen at a time, and we'd sell them, and the money went into building the church itself. The other thing we used to do to raise money for the church was hand out the phone books. Yeah. Luckily we had a guy, Rob Smith, who used to drive for SHF and he would hook up a trailer behind, or he'd bring a semi-trailer load of phone books we had a contract at St Clair to hand out the yellow pages and also the white pages, so it would be twice a year. And boy, they were hard days. But we earned money for the church. And I think from memory, if my memory serves me correct, we used to get something like $1,700 a day just for handing out these books. But it was hard work. But we did it to build a church. This is how God has led this church. We talked before about numbers. I forget who it was, said the numbers come and go and so on. And I remember in Peter Thurkoff's time when he was here, no OH&S problems back then, but we had so many people trying to cram in here, we'd have to put chairs down the aisle, down each of these two sides here. Now, we can't do it today, it's just not safe. It wasn't safe then either, but we did it. And during the singing of the last hymn, the deacons would have to start at the back and they'd tap somebody on the shoulder and say, "Don't sit down, I'm taking your chair away." Go to the next one, "Don't sit down, we're taking your chair away." We did it. That's how the numbers were in this church. It had come from nothing, a handful of people, and now we had the place packed out. But we see churches go in cycles. And after that, numbers dropped off again. And it's sad, but that's the way it is. And then we remember when Pastor Sam came here, numbers started to increase again. And what did we do then? It was getting to the stage, what are we going to do? It'd be packed out nearly every Sabbath morning. And it was about that time we decided to move the PA media upstairs. And so we decided to knock the hole in the wall up there, and so they could see out. That was half the room. What were we going to do with the other half? The library's there. But then we were thinking, now if we take another section out there, we had talks about it. Nothing official at board or anything like that, but we were talking about it. We could knock the other section out there. We could put a little balcony in up there, and we could seat another 30 people. This is what we were thinking about. But numbers started dropping off again. And unfortunately, numbers have dropped. Nothing to do with our pastors, by the way. That's just the way it is. That's the way it is in churches. And I was thinking too about how we've been led in this church by different ministers. And these are in no particular order, but I just went through and thought of the ones that I could think of. And I haven't included exactly what they've done, but the first one that came to mind was Pastor Lester Hawkes. And Heather and I ended up becoming good friends with his son and daughter-in-law, my namesake, Lyndon, and he was Lyndon Hawkes, I was Lynn James. And we became good friends. And I remember at one stage we were without a car and they lent us a car for a while. So the family themselves. Pastor Hawkes had come from the mission fields in Papua New Guinea, came here and helped to lead out in the church. Pastor George Metcalf, I've mentioned before, he was an evangelist and he ran a couple of big programs here, a lot of hard work in that. And so it was all God's leading and building up of the church. While Pastor Metcalf was here, he had an intern from college in the name of Peter Harper. Remember Peter Harper? And when Pastor George moved off, Peter ended up looking after the church itself. Then at some stage in the future we had Pastor Lionel Smith, Senior, also a retired missionary. And he was so used to the mission fields that he'd only just be getting wound up now at this time on Sabbath morning, and it was regular that he'd preach till about 1 o'clock. They were very long sermons. Great guy. And I had the privilege of meeting up with him not long ago, and he still remembered different ones in Penrith Church. He's in his 80s or more than that now, I can't remember. But he remembered, and he talked about Enid Brown. He was asking about different ones in the church and Richard and so on. And it was good to sit down, and his mind is as sharp today as it ever was. In his 80s or 90s, I can't remember what it is. He's still doing Bible studies, he's still doing preaching, he's still doing Sabbath school lessons. Just a really live sort of guy. We had David Pearce, and David was here for quite a few years, then Peter Thurkoff. Bob Steed, remember Bob Steed? He was only here for a very short time. We had a guy by the name of Adrian Ebens, our shortest serving pastor ever, I think. Adrian wasn't well and he was only here for 3 months. And he hadn't been with Conference long enough to have them move him when he wanted to move back to Queensland for health reasons. And this church and Warramoo Church, the youth and the young people got together and raised enough money to move him. I drew the short straw and had to drive the truck, but that was okay. Everything was paid for. But the church did that. They worked together and did it. We also had a guy by the name of Mike Parker. Mike was only here for a couple of years, but at good times as well with Mike. And we turned up at church one week and Mike wasn't here, and we found out that his wife had gone to England for a visit, and when they landed at Heathrow, the plane had skidded off the runway. She was okay, everybody was okay, but he felt he needed to go. Some of the things that happen. Michael made mention of Peter Jack, another evangelist that came and was here. And Gavin Rowe. Remember Gavin? We had some good times with Gavin. And of course Sam, an evangelist. And then we had a guy by the name of Roger Vince. Who remembers Roger? Where's Maggie? Of course she does. Roger came to us as a single man and left with a wife. He did, yep. David Blanche from conference president. And over the years, different ones have led this church and built it to what it is today. They've all had their part to play in it. And I remember, I was thinking about some other things too, and Karina actually reminded me, we had different very conservative pastors, and it was a no-no for our youth to be playing sport, competitive sport, you know. And we're so thankful that a guy by the name of Fred Sheen decided he was going to introduce the youth to touch footy and cricket. And what an inspiration Fred was with these young guys. So much so that we now have a guy who was a leading elder in what's the church? Warhope Church. In Warhope Church, as a head elder, Dave Hall, came into the church because these guys were playing their sport. He appreciated what he saw and how they played and how they reacted with one another, and he came and joined the church. Dave did a lot for us. Just before he moved up north, he spent a whole night. He'd worked, we had a lot of electrical problems, and David spent a whole night getting it all finished before he left, all the electrical works. We had some help from some of the other members as well. But this is how God has led. This guy now is, like he's come into the church and he is now a head elder. We have nothing to fear for the future. God's leading us, remember God's leading, and take our courage from that and keep focused on the prize. Paul has said, I focus on this one thing, looking forward to what lies ahead. I press on to reach the end of the race and receive the heavenly prize. We need to remember how God has led us, but look at that heavenly prize that awaits each one of us. In Isaiah, just to quote a couple of verses in closing, so do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And in Hebrews, now may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, equip you with everything good for doing his will, and may he work in us what is pleasing to him, through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. May God bless us each one this morning as we move forward. And remember too that, yes, some of us are moving away, but that's me leaving room for others to come in. Let's look at the positives, not the negatives. I'd ask you to come and join me now as we sing our closing hymn, hymn number 518, Standing on the Promise.